The snow had already started to fall when the letter arrived at the old Whitcomb house on the edge of Harrow's End. Its pale envelope carried no return address, only a crude wax seal pressed with an unfamiliar crest. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, its ink so black it seemed to drink the candlelight. "They will find him at the base of the elm before the moon dies," it read. The words carried no name, no signature, and yet the Whitcomb family understood at once who it spoke of. For decades, they had lived with visions of what was to come. These were not dreams or guesses, but clear, cruel previews of the exact moment of another's passing. They had learned to speak of it in whispers and never to strangers. But on that frigid evening, when the family matriarch, Eleanor Whitcomb, read the message aloud, every head at the table lowered in silence. They knew the visions had begun again, and somewhere in Harrow's End, a man had already been marked by fate. By morning, the village was already buzzing. Word had spread that Thomas Keating, the town's wheelwright, had been found frozen beneath the sprawling branches of the old elm near the crossroads, exactly as the letter foretold. The coroner called it an accident, a collapse brought on by the bitter cold. But the Whitcombs knew better, they always did. They had seen it days before it happened, just as they had foreseen the drowning of Mary Keller in the mill pond 2 winters ago, and the fire that took the O'Connell barn in spring. They had never been wrong, not once, and yet, for all their accuracy, they had never been able to change a single outcome. The villagers suspected their knowledge, but dared not speak it aloud, for there was something unnerving about the Whitcombs, the way their eyes seemed to follow you, as though they could already see the moment your heart would stop beating. On that morning, as the church bell tolled for Keating, Eleanor Whitcomb stood at her frost-covered window and whispered to her eldest son, "It's beginning again." The Whitcombs kept their gift, or curse, within the bloodline. No neighbor had ever been told the full truth, not even the reverend. But behind the heavy oak doors of their home, there was no pretending. Visions came without warning. Sometimes they arrived in the dead of night, dragging the dreamer from sleep into scenes that felt sharper than reality, the smell of smoke, the sound of ice cracking, the exact tone of a last scream. Other times, the visions struck in daylight, freezing the afflicted in place, their eyes clouding as if they were staring through time itself. Each member of the family experienced it differently. Eleanor felt hers like a cold hand gripping the back of her neck. Her daughter, Clara, would hear a faint ticking, like a clock with no source, moments before the images seized her mind. And Daniel, the eldest son, had once described the sensation as drowning in a mirror. But however the warning came, the result was always the same. The Whitcombs saw death coming for others, and were powerless to intervene. The townsfolk kept their distance, though no one admitted why. The Whitcombs were polite enough, their manners proper, their clothing always in keeping with the season, but an unspoken fear clung to them like the fog that often rolled in from the marshes. People said that if a Whitcomb looked at you for too long, it meant they'd seen your end. Children were pulled away from their path in the market. Conversations hushed when one entered the post office. The family accepted this exile in silence, for they had learned long ago that their knowledge was not a blessing, but a burden that made them pariahs. Still, the visions came, uninvited and unstoppable. That winter of 1899, however, was diffy, errant. The frequency of the deaths began to climb, as though an unseen force had quickened the pace of fate itself. And with each passing week, the Whitcombs felt the invisible circle of doom drawing tighter, its center creeping ever closer to their own doorstep. It was Clara who saw it first. She had been tending to the oil lamps in the parlor when the ticking began. Slow at first, then frantic, as though counting down to something inevitable. Her hands trembled as the room dissolved around her. In its place rose the shadowed silhouette of a man standing in knee-deep snow, his breath steaming in the air. His coat was torn, one gloved hand pressed to his chest, the other clutching a small leather-bound book. Behind him loomed the Whitcomb house, its windows dark, its front door ajar. Clara knew the man, not from the village, but from somewhere far more intimate. Her own blood. She could see her brother Daniel's face beneath the frost and pallor, his lips forming a name she couldn't hear. The vision broke, leaving Clara gasping, the lamplight wavering as she steadied herself against the wall. For the first time in her life, she had seen the death of one of their own. Clara did not tell anyone at first. She spent the night pacing her narrow room beneath the slanted rafters, the wind rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers. Her mind clawed at the image, trying to find some detail that could be changed, a direction Daniel might take, a word she might speak to avert what she had seen. But she knew better. Every attempt the Whitcombs had ever made to interfere with fate had ended the same way. The death still came, and sometimes in a crueler manner than before. By dawn, Clara's eyes were red from lack of sleep. She descended to the kitchen where Eleanor was kneading bread. Without turning, her mother spoke in a voice low and steady. "You saw one of us this time." It was not a question. Clara froze. The scent of yeast and wood smoke suddenly felt suffocating. "Daniel," she hissed, paired. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dough, her shoulders rigid. "Then it means the circle has finally closed," she said. "We are next." Daniel knew nothing of Clara's vision, but he had noticed the way his mother's eyes lingered on him at supper, and how Clara's hand would sometimes flinch when it brushed against his. He carried himself with the quiet suspicion of a man who senses a shadow trailing him, but cannot name its shape. The days that followed were bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes sound itself seem to freeze in the air. On the third morning, a letter appeared on the Whitcomb doorstep, identical to the one that had foretold Thomas Keating's fate. The wax seal was the same, the paper thick and heavy. Inside, in that same deep black ink, was a single line. "By the elm again, but the snow will be deeper." No name, no date, but they all knew who it meant. Daniel set the letter down with a firmness that made the oil lamp flicker. "I will not run," he said. "If it comes, it comes." His defiance was brave in voice, but his eyes betrayed the unease of a man already hearing the echo of his own final breath. Eleanor gathered the family in the drawing room that evening, the fire snapping in the hearth as if to punctuate her every word. The curtains were drawn tight, the oil lamps turned low. She laid the ominous letter on the table between them, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper as though it might burn her. "We've had warnings before," she said, "but never for one of us, and never twice in a single season." Her voice carried the weight of generations, for the Whitcombs had kept careful records of every vision and its grim fulfillment since the 1700s. Daniel sat back in his chair, arms folded, as Clara stared into the flames, her lips pale. "We could leave," Clara offered weakly, but Eleanor shook her head. "The road you take to avoid fate is the very road that leads you to it." The room fell silent except for the hiss of the logs. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then stopped, as if silenced by the same invisible presence that now seemed to coil around the Whitcomb home. The snow deepened with each passing day, muffling the world in a suffocating quiet. Daniel kept to his routines, chopping wood, checking the traps, bringing in supplies from the village, but every step past the old elm made his pulse quicken. Its gnarled branches clawed at the winter sky, and the wind through them carried a low, mournful whistle. He began to notice small details he'd never paid attention to before, the way the snow seemed undisturbed no matter how many passed by, the faint indentation in the earth around its base, as though something heavy had once been buried there. Clara watched from the window whenever he left, her hands tight around the fabric of her dress, counting each minute until his return. But on the morning of January the 27th, as the pale sun rose over the frozen marsh, Daniel failed to come back on time. The clock in the hall struck noon, and the space by the door where his boots should have stood remained empty. Clara was the first to feel it. That peculiar stillness, as though the air itself had paused. She rushed to the front hall, pulling on her shawl with trembling hands, but Eleanor stepped into her path. The older woman's face was ashen, her voice a quiet command. "You will not go to him." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. "If we do nothing, he will die." Eleanor's reply was barely a whisper. "He will die whether we go or not." The weight of those words pressed the breath from Clara's chest. Outside, the snow was falling in wide, lazy flakes, each one landing without sound. Somewhere beyond the fields, the old elm waited, its dark silhouette barely visible through the white curtain. In her mind, Clara saw the vision again, Daniel's torn coat, the leather book in his hand, his lips forming that unspoken name. But now, she realized something that had eluded her before. In the vision, there had been another figure in the snow, just beyond his shoulder, watching. The figure had been nothing more than a blur in Clara's first vision, a shadow without a face. But now the memory sharpened, and she could see the faint outline of a tall man in a long, dark overcoat, his hat brim low, obscuring his eyes. He had stood perfectly still as Daniel faltered in the snow, as if waiting for that exact moment. Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. Who was he? No villager owned such a coat, and no one from Harrow's End would linger at the elm in a storm. She thought of the letter, of the black ink that seemed older than the paper itself. Could the man be the one sending them? Clara wanted to tell her mother, but Eleanor's rigid silence kept her words locked in her throat. The Whitcombs had survived this long by never confronting the sender of fate, only enduring it. But Clara felt a shift in the cold that day, as if the visions were no longer warnings, but by nightfall, Daniel still had not returned. The wind clawed at the shutters, slipping icy fingers through every crack in the house. Eleanor lit no lamps, choosing instead to let the darkness settle thick around them. Clara sat near the hearth, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the door as though willing it to open. Somewhere above, a floorboard creaked, a slow, deliberate sound, as if made by a careful foot. But no one had gone upstairs. Clara's head snapped up, and she caught Eleanor's eyes across the room. The older woman had heard it too. They waited, holding their breath, until the sound came again, heavier this time, then silence. The clock ticked on, each swing of the pendulum sounding louder in the stillness. Clara wanted to speak, but before she could, a faint knock echoed from the back door. Not the hurried pounding of a neighbor in distress, but 3 slow, evenly spaced taps, like a signal prearranged long ago. Eleanor rose, her shadow stretching tall across the walls, and moved toward the sound. The back door groaned as Eleanor unlatched it, the winter wind immediately spilling in, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and something else, something metallic. Standing just beyond the threshold was a man in a long, dark overcoat, the very figure from Clara's vision. His face was pale, angular, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. In his gloved hand, he held the small, leather-bound book Clara had seen clutched in Daniel's grasp. Without a word, he extended it toward Eleanor. The moment her fingers touched the cover, Clara saw her mother's expression falter, a flicker of grief so raw it hollowed her eyes. Eleanor did not open the book. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing the stranger to cross the threshold. His boots left no trace of snow on the floor. He moved to the center of the room, set the book on the table, and then vanished. As though he had never been there at all. The only sound was the fire, hissing softly in its stone cradle. Clara's gaze locked on the book, her heart pounding. She knew that whatever lay within was not meant to be read aloud. For a long time, neither woman moved. The leather-bound book sat between them like a living thing, its cover worn smooth by hands long dead. A faint warmth seemed to radiate from it, despite the cold that had followed the stranger into the room. Finally, Eleanor reached forward and unfastened the clasp. The hinges groaned like a coffin lid. Inside, the pages were filled with names, hundreds of them, each written in that same black, unyielding ink. Next to every name was a date and a location. Some entries stretched back decades, others were yet to come. Clara leaned closer, scanning the list until her eyes caught on a familiar one. Daniel Whitcomb, January 27th, 1899. Elm at Crossroads. Her breath caught in her throat. Just below it, written in the same hand, was another. Clara Whitcomb, January 30th, 1899, Whitcomb House. And beneath that, the final entry, Eleanor Whitcomb, February 2nd, 1899, Whitcomb House. The dates were only days away. Clara's fingers curled into fists, her nails biting into her palms as she stared at the neat, merciless handwriting. It was not simply a prediction. It was an execution schedule, carved into time itself. Eleanor closed the book slowly, as if the act could somehow erase the ink, but her face betrayed no panic. "It has always been this way," she said softly. "We have only been spared because the circle had not yet reached us." Clara's voice cracked. "Then we change it. We run." Clara realized with a chill that perhaps they were not alone, that whoever kept the ledger of deaths might already be inside, marking the moments as they passed. The night stretched long and airless, the kind where the silence seems to have weight. Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the beams above, listening for the stranger's tread. Every creak of the timbers sounded deliberate, every shift of the wind against the shutters like a whisper just beyond comprehension. At some hour past midnight, she heard it, the faint ticking that always came before a vision. It began at the edge of her hearing, then grew louder until it seemed to fill the room. Her breath caught as her sight clouded over, and the walls dissolved into swirling snow. She stood in the parlor, though she was not truly there, and Daniel lay slumped in a chair by the fire, his coat still dusted with frost. The door was open, and through it drifted the figure in the long coat, setting the ledger gently in Eleanor's lap before turning his gaze directly to Clara. His eyes, now visible beneath the brim, were utterly black. And then, in a voice that did not sound human, he said, "You were never meant to change it, only to know." Clara woke with a cry strangled in her throat, the ticking gone, but the echo of that voice still vibrating in her bones. She sat upright, clutching the quilt to her chest, and listened. The house was unnervingly still. Too still. No wind, no shifting timbers, no faint murmur from Eleanor's room down the hall. Pulling on her shawl, Clara crept to the staircase and peered into the darkness below. That was when she saw it, the ledger, sitting open on the table, though they had left it clasped shut the night before. She descended slowly, each step a groan beneath her weight, and crossed to the book. The ink beside Daniel's name was no longer flat black. It shimmered faintly. Ike, fresh blood in candlelight. And the space next to her own name, once filled with a date, now bore an exact time, 10:14 p.m. Clara's breath came faster. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was already 9:52. The ticking returned, louder now, spilling from every corner of the room as though the entire house had become a clock. Clara's hands shook as she backed away from the ledger, her eyes darting to the shadows that pooled along the walls. Upstairs, a floorboard gave a slow, deliberate groan, not the sound of settling wood, but of weight shifting. She wanted to run to Eleanor, to wake her, but some instinct told her it would change nothing. The fire in the hearth guttered, throwing the room into a stuttering dance of light and dark. And then she saw him. The man in the long coat stood at the far end of the hallway, half hidden in shadow, his face a pale oval beneath the brim. He did not move toward her, only raised one gloved hand and tapped the air once, twice, 3 times, as if counting down. Clara's gaze snapped to the mantel clock. 10:13. 1 minute left. The final seconds dragged like hours. Clara's pulse pounded so hard she could hear nothing else, yet the ticking still cut through, precise and unyielding. She took one step back, and the man in the long coat mirrored it forward, his movements fluid, almost soundless. The shadows seemed to cling to him, swallowing the space he left behind. At 10:14 exactly, the clock's chime rang out. Deep, resonant, final. The air in the room thickened, pressing in on her lungs. The stranger lifted his head, and for the first time Clara saw what lay beneath. When Clara's eyes opened, she was no longer in the parlor. She stood outside beneath the sprawling elm, the snow waist-deep and glistening under a moon that seemed far too large. The village lay silent beyond the fields, every house dark, every chimney cold. In front of her, Daniel knelt in the snow, the leather-bound ledger clutched to his chest, his breath shallow, his eyes locked on something behind her. She turned slowly, knowing what she would see. The man in the long coat, his faceless void now wider, deeper, like an open grave in the air. He extended one hand toward the book, and Daniel, with trembling fingers, passed it to him. Without a word, the stranger opened it and, with a pen of glistening black, crossed Daniel's name from the page. Then he turned to Clara. She felt her body step forward, unbidden, her hands reaching for the ledger as though it were hers by right. In that moment, she understood the cruel truth. When your name is marked, you are not the victim. You are the next keeper. And the visions, they are not warnings at all. They are orders.